Hey, what's up, everybody? It's the Super Sleuth coming at you with the sponsor for this episode, which is Cornerstone Tea. You need to go to cornerstoneteacompany.com right now and get yourself some of the finest handcrafted fresh teas. It's insane, guys. Like, they have classic flavors like this chai right here, but this chai is cranked up to 11. It's high caffeine, and when you open this bad boy up, it just hits you with smells, man. You know, it's what I would think the Garden of Eden smells like. And guys, this is a Christian company. We should be supporting them. I know I've been drinking this tea while I've been sleuthing as well. The instructions to brew this tea are right here also on the front, which makes it super easy for you. And when they sent me this tea, guys, they also gave me some awesome stickers. Who doesn't like getting goodies? So enough about that. Let's talk about the company. The company is a business that seeks to keep God's kingdom at the center of operations through regular cost-specific tea blends to benefit missionaries and charities. That's right. Part of the proceeds goes to help the kingdom of God worldwide. Also, they have a comprehensive approach to nationwide wholesale wherein optional service training and innovative exclusive tea blending come alongside this excellent product. So don't stop with just listening to this ad. Go to cornerstoneteacompany.com and use the code in all caps right here, Cultish10, no spaces either, to get 10% off your first order. Get yourself some tea and change the way that you've been living your morning routine. Talk to you later, guys.
John Marco Allegro was a scholar who was also he was an agnostic. He was agnostic, but he was an ordained minister. So he became an ordained minister, and then he started studying theology, and eventually became agnostic. But he was a language expert, and so he was hired to decipher the Dead Sea Scrolls. So they did it for 14 years. He deciphered these things. They're putting together these. They had to use DNA because they had to make sure that the cow, the fragments were from the same cow, which would indicate that it was the same piece of skin.
Okay.
Because it's literally on animal skins. They found them in these ceramic vessels in Qumran, hidden in the side of a mountain. Wild shit. So they take these down. They realize this is the oldest version of the Bible by far. And I think it's in Aramaic. It's one of the only ones in Aramaic. And at the end of this translation, over 14 years, John Marco Allegro writes a book called The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross. And he says the entire religion was a misunderstanding. And what it was originally about was psychedelic mushrooms and fertility rituals. And that's what created this religion. These people were taking mushrooms, and they were experiencing God, and they were having fertility rituals because they were trying to be as bountiful and have as many babies as possible. And that's what the Bible was originally all about.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Cultish, entering the kingdom of the cults. My name's Jeremiah Roberts, one of the co-hosts here. Hi, Andrew. How are you, man?
I'm doing well. I guess Joe Rogan now has me questioning everything I ever thought I believed about the Bible. Do I have mushrooms hidden in the back drawers underneath my books? Like, should I? What's going on here?
I know. Are we really a podcast about cults host that's really about a mushroom fertility cult? Wow. Well, that's, so we're going to unpack that. What you just heard there is a clip from the great digital Areopagus of the world, the Joe Rogan Experience, where he is articulating a book that we are going to be talking about today. The book is called The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross by John Marco Allegro. And we have back with us Wess Huff, who's on the podcast with us today. Glad you are back, my friend.
Always a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So, so John Marco Allegro, this is something, and these talking points, it seems to be really kind of getting some attention. You see people like Joe Rogan talking about it. There's people like Lex Friedman, who are also articulating this. There's another book, The Immortality Key, where the two authors there were on Jordan Peterson about a year ago, really articulating, these same talking points, talking about ancient religion, the connection to psychedelics. And man, that's really a mouthful. So the book, Sacred Mushroom and the Cross, I binged through it on Audible at 1.7 speed just to kind of get a grasp on it. And my goodness, it's hard to even know where to begin. So first of all, let everyone just know just a little bit about who you are in regards to what might make you somewhat of a qualified person to give some commentary on this subject of the sacred mushroom and the cross.
Yeah. So as the listener might know from our previous episodes, my name is Wess Huff. I am a resident of Toronto, Canada. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Toronto in New Testament and Christian origins. I study early Christian scribal culture, and I am also the director of Central Canada for a ministry called Apologetics Canada. And so my area of expertise has to do with Christian manuscripts, early Christian church history, and issues related to that. So if we're talking about John Marco Allegro, I mean, I'm not a Dead Sea Scroll expert, but I have read The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross. I've done a fair amount of work on some of the Greek manuscripts of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which exist. And so as it pertains to this issue, it's an issue that I might not be like a formal expert on, but I deal with a lot in terms of the adjacent issues related to the manuscripts that make up the history of the biblical text. And even just in my own ministry work, I do a lot of work on university campuses, and the Sacred Mushroom and the Cross and Marco Allegro's theory have been brought up numerous times to me on university campuses in ministry settings because Joe Rogan is popular.
Yeah.
Right? Newsflash. I don't know if you know this, but Joe Rogan is a very popular podcast out there. Maybe it's catching up to Cultish a little bit. It's almost there, but
yeah, he's an up and coming podcaster. Hopefully, maybe one of these days, maybe one of these days he can be on our podcast. We'll give him a boost. But
that's right. Yeah.
Yes, but just real quickly, and Andrew, I'll let you jump in here in a second. But at the very beginning, we played that clip, obviously in the middle of that one Joe Rogan episode. But how would you describe, if anyone's living under a rock, I've never heard about this book, how would you explain it to them? Because even if they haven't read this book, it's very possible they might have someone in close proximity who might believe something similar to this, or just is very interested and open to the idea of utilizing psychedelics, because that's becoming normalized as well too. How would you explain the overall thesis of the Sacred Mushroom and the Cross?
Yeah, it is interesting because I think that John Marco Allegro, if it wasn't for individuals like Joe Rogan, he and his work would really just kind of fade into obscurity, because although, as you heard in that clip, John Marco Allegro was a legitimate scholar, he was a biblical archaeologist, and he was part of the Dead Sea Scrolls team, which did kind of collate and translate the original discoveries of the Dead Sea Scrolls. John Marco Allegro and his later work, The Sacred Mushroom on the Cross, really kind of ostracized him academically, because what he proposed was that the Christian religion, as kind of Joe Rogan hypothesized there, or articulated there, the Christian religion was more or less a misunderstanding based from hallucinogenic cults, from fertility cults. And so what Allegro did is, in his most infamous work, The Sacred Mushroom on the Cross, which made somewhat of a resurgence due to individuals like Rogan promoting it, it relates to the development of language through etymological roots to the development of myths, religions, and cultic practices in world cultures. And so where this comes into what we're talking about is that through those kind of tracing of the origins of words, that's what etymology means. What Allegro did is he looked at particular words in the Bible that he kind of sectioned out, and then he came to the conclusion that Jesus did not exist, that the Gospels were a hoax, and that Christianity turned into it as we know it today via nothing more than the misunderstanding of ancient fertility cults in which the object of worship was a psychedelic mushroom. So that's a big claim, right?
Yeah.
Especially considering, us 2,000 years later as Christians, people who claim to follow Jesus Christ. If what he's really saying is true, then we have more than gone astray in our understanding of who Jesus was and is.
Yeah, Andrew, what questions do you have? What are your thoughts so far, just with what are you saying?
My question is what is the context of the Sacred Mushroom and the Cross? Like, who was Allegro writing to? And is it even like a book that the typical person is able to pick up and really understand some of the arguments that he's making?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think it's not as clear to me who the intended audience is. Because at times it's very simple. And at times he's relying on the audience to understand etymology based on ancient Sumerian. And that's a big ask for a regular book reader to know. I mean, it requires the reader to have a working knowledge of ancient languages like Sumerian and other ancient Semitic languages alongside some cursory biblical scholarship. And I think that's a tall order for anyone, an expert or not. And if you try to read The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross, and you end up wading through a lot of the jargon and linguistics that made, even me, as someone who's interested and studies this stuff, a little bit confused at times, then I would say that it's actually pretty hard to peg down the actual audience that Allegro is trying to write to.
Hey guys, if you listen to this podcast, you or someone you know has probably been a victim of spiritual abuse. In addition to educating us all about these harmful groups, Cultish is proud to partner with Be Emboldened, a non-profit dedicated to finding freedom from spiritual abuse. The founder, Naomi Wright, has been a guest on our show more than once. She shared her own personal story with us, which is something we really appreciate about Be Emboldened. They have the education and the training, but they also just get it on a personal level. It makes the special opportunity they have for Cultish listeners today that much better. Be Emboldened provides excellent resources and practical help from trained professionals to walk alongside survivors, their loved ones, and church leaders and professionals seeking to serve this very real and growing need more effectively. They know that the cost of professional mentoring, expert consulting, and top-notch digital courses can be tough, though they're excited to announce a new way for everyone to access help, hope, and healing. With Be Emboldened's brand new Plus membership, you'll gain access to the exclusive content, expert mentoring, thought-provoking blogs, curated content, discounts, and more. Check out their new BE Plus membership at beemboldened.com/membership and use the code Cultish50 at checkout for 50% off your first month subscription. That's Cultish50 for 50% off. Here's to living out freedom.
Yeah, and also, let me ask you this too: it is interesting that it came out in the 1970s, which was a time where the experimentation with those sorts of drugs were a regular, started to become really normalized, which is interesting. But maybe also explain to our audience, just because even the word etymology, you said that's the nature of language, the nature of words, but specifically a lot of times the nature of language, the nature of words is really contingent upon your worldview. Would you be able to explain, how should a Christian think about etymology? And what are also wrong ways too? There's fallacies in regards to etymology as well too. There's incorrect ways. Could you maybe help our audience kind of understand that? Because that's kind of a big part of this whole discussion about this book.
Yeah, so etymology is an issue that I think we as Christians should really be aware of, because a lot of individuals with maybe a first year knowledge of biblical Greek often commit etymological fallacies, because we start to learn about the origins of words and that say, this part of this word comes from this Greek or this Latin word, and so therefore it means this, and we can really get ourselves into trouble. There's a lot of depth and a lot of things that we can learn from learning the origins of word and learning languages like Greek and Latin. But the etymological fallacy is when we use those and make more of the words than really is merited by the meaning of those words alone. So even a typical example you'll hear in a sermon that's an example of an etymological fallacy is if someone says, the word we translate as church is the word ecclesia, and ek means out of, and kaleo means to call. And that's those two words, ek kaleo, ecclesia. And so the church means the called out ones. And so this is ascribed some further meaning to it. And maybe we can even get something very encouraging, edifying from that. The problem is that by the first century, ecclesia did not mean the called out ones, even if maybe that meant what the original intention was. Ecclesia, as the word that's more often translated as congregation. I mean, we have ecclesias of Greek officials who gathered together. It simply means gathering together. And so we have to be very careful when we talk about etymology, because etymology and tracing the etymological roots of particular words in the Bible or anywhere else can often lead us into problems. And this is one of the cruxes, I think, of something like Marco Allegro's work. And actually, his fellow academics within his field, his contemporaries, they really pointed out to him and said, this doesn't work. This causes a lot of problems, because if you look at the etymological roots of any words, that's not necessarily how you get meaning. You don't get meaning necessarily from just the etymological root of a word. So even if we assume that he's right about the symbolic connections between various words and ideas and concepts across religious texts, we're stuck with this very serious elephant in the room. And that's the fact that Allegro based his entire thesis on tracing the origins of the words. And you can't do that, because the etymological fallacy, which is a genetic fallacy that states that a word or phrase's true proper meaning is derived directly out of the oldest meaning of said words or the compound components of the words. The problem with that is that the meanings of words change over time. So a word's definition at any point in time can't be established from its origins, its etymology. The way we find out the true proper meaning of a word or phrase is by looking at how it's used within its context, whether culturally or contextually. So let me use an example that I use actually in my YouTube video that where I address the sacred mushroom and the cross. Jeremiah, if I said the word awful, what does the word awful mean?
It means,
how would you define it?
Something terrible. Usually if I taste something like in relation to food, I think last time I said awful, I remember one time I utilized it, was I tried this green tea at this hipster coffee shop, and it just tasted like old fermented algae, and I didn't know how do you charge $4 for this? And so I just said, this is awful. That's how I utilized that word in that moment.
Yeah, algae coffee sounds awful.
Yes.
You can even see how I was messing up my words there.
Yeah.
Algae coffee sounds awful.
Yes.
There, we got it right. Yeah, well, etymologically, if you were to break that word apart, you would find that it means, in the English language, full of awe. In that, you were awestrucken by that coffee. It's actually a positive. And if you go back to something like the 18th century, that's the way it was used. It was used positively to express, you would find writings that would talk about the awfulness of God, how full of awe we are as human beings at the concept of God. That is not how we use the word today. And so you would be very misled by an etymological explanation of the word awful. Because if you were to tell me that the tea that you were charged $4 for that was made out of algae was awful, and I was very academic about it and sat down and broke apart the components of the words and thought, what, Jeremiah really liked that tea. He liked that tea so much, he was awestrucken by it. It was probably the best tea he's ever tasted in his life.
Yeah.
I would literally be led to the opposite conclusion of what you meant. And so that's where something like the etymological fallacy goes really astray. And so if Allegro or anyone else really is hedging their bets, if they're betting their thesis on something like the etymology of words, they're not just in dangerous territory, they're actually, they have to be really careful that they're not being led astray, like I would be if I sat down and broke apart the components of your $4 tea experience that was awful.
No, that definitely that makes sense. Andrew, what's on your mind?
Yeah, so is one way to spot like an etymological fallacy is by, let's say this man makes an argument, Allegro, stating that the true meaning of the text is actually different than what all of the text is actually explaining. Right? Like the text in John 1 states that Jesus Christ has been God from eternity, right? And that he took on flesh. But for some reason, he comes up with a explanation through the totality of whatever this 14 years that work that he did through secret knowledge hidden in words and roots actually contradicts the text itself that we have in the New Testament. Is that one way to spot like a genetic etymological fallacy? You see what I'm trying to say? I'm trying to say it, but I'm not a scholar like you are.
Yeah, I think we can take those types of breakdowns and we can say, oh, okay, that's interesting. But why do all modern English translations translate it the way that it's translated today? Why do we have not just one English translation, but a plethora of English translations, all faithful English translations that rely on translation committees, that groups of scholars who can weed out any one individual's kind of bias or leaning one way or the other? Why is it that they translate it the way that they do? And then we can say, okay, well, based on that, how do we have more trust in this one scholar who's gone off in a very different direction, or do we have trust in basically every modern translation? And we have to be careful here, right? Because this is I'm not trying to make the argument of majority, that because the majority of scholars make a particular argument that it's true. I don't believe things. I believe Jesus is God. Yeah. And that's not a majority position in New Testament scholarship. So, there's an obvious and clear outlier to this type of argumentation. However, it's not just that, it's a majority position. It's every position over and against Allegro. And even if you look at some of the other individuals on the Dead Sea Scroll Committee who interacted with Allegro, if you look at some of their communication, which you can find online, you have to do a little bit of digging, but you can find it. They all were kind of like, Allegro, you got to calm down on this. Like this doesn't really make sense. You're compromising your academic credibility. And I mean, Rogan on a number of his podcasts and a couple of other people, I think more or less because of Rogan, have promulgated the idea that the Catholic Church bought up the rights to the Sacred Mushroom and the Cross and kind of that they suppressed it for a little point in time. If you actually look into the history of it, the publisher dropped the printing because it was just not making any money. So he just dropped the printing. It wasn't bought up by the Vatican and suppressed because the Vatican thought that this was a threat. It was literally that, they weren't selling any copies, so they just stopped printing them. And then at a later point in time, it was brought back. Yeah. But I think that speaks to the fact that this is something that Marco Allegro was off in the corner promulgating, and the rest of the world of New Testament scholarship and early Christianity, even secular critical scholarship, was not on board with what he was saying. And it didn't just have to do with the fact that he was talking about hallucinogenic compounds, which he was. It had to do with the fact that even if we gave Marco Allegro the benefit of the doubt and assumed that his reconstruction of words like Christ are true, which they aren't, by the way, even if we grant him all of that and give him the credit, we simply can use his methodology and say that it's based on the idea that the first century Koine Greek, which is the language that the New Testament was written in, had a Semitic substratum, which is what he claimed, and that under the Semitic substratum lies the Sumerian, which doesn't work linguistically, but let's say it does. After that, he's making an argument that relies solely on the etymological fallacy, which is kind of the cake topper to a failed theory. So he's jumping a number of different fields, linguistics and philology and etymology, all of these ologies. And even if we go through all of those, he's really not fulfilling the criteria that would convince any scholar in any one of those individual fields that what he's communicating is true.
Okay. Give us some examples of what of his actual argumentation. What does that look like tangibly? So when I read the book, like I saw the differences where he is arguing for the Greek language, the Sumerian language, but then he would take an example talking about like the Lord's Supper, like New Testament, talking about the Lord's Supper, taking the cup, and how Paul talks about if you take the Lord's Supper improperly, you'll come under a stricter form of judgment. And you'll take all these different instances in the New Testament where, like, I think it might have even been Jesus' baptism, or just all these instances where he's connecting it to a mushroom or to a psychedelic experience, and then he utilizes some sort of correlation with the ancient language. And then if you look at the Old Testament, for example, he'll take Sinai and how the Israelites and Moses, they followed that pillar through the wilderness, and then he would sort of utilize the same thing, and it was just like one example after another. Like, how would you describe like his argumentation? Like, what is it? Yeah, from your perspective, what does that look like?
Unfortunately, what it misses is putting Jesus in his first century socio-religious cultural setting. So there's the old idiom: if you hear hoofbeats, don't think zebras, think horses. And when we look at Jesus and we think of the Lord's Supper and we see that ritual, we don't need to jump to hallucinogenic mushrooms. We can think the Passover. Mm-hmm. We can put it within its cultural perspective and say, okay, there's an actual cultural religious setting to this particular event. In fact, last Sunday, I just preached upon at my home church, because I'm an elder at my church. I preached on in Luke and his accounting of Jesus being betrayed by Judas, mm-hmm. and the idea that was at the Passover. Yeah, that there was this cultural context for this celebration of the Old Covenant community, the nation of Israel, being rescued from oppression and rescued from slavery, and that Jesus is taking that, and really that's the last true Passover meal, because then Jesus in the new covenant establishes that now that takes on a broader meaning. That's not just a rescue from slavery, but a rescue from sin and death, and that gives us a cultural context for that. Yeah, and so Allegro wants to jump to conclusions, and he wants to start with, okay, well, there's this background to this that has to do with ritualistic cults that are based on things like what's the word I'm looking for? Fertility. Yes, that are based on fertility. And so when we have these compounds, and this is related to what you were saying before with the immortality key, where wine is used within these other religious contexts in the Greco-Roman world. Yeah. But what that ignores is that Jesus is a first century Jew participating in a first century Jewish context of the Passover meal, and that there's a fulfilling of that, in that then he's establishing that in his own sacrifice. And so I don't think we need to jump to the conclusion that, let's look at the linguistic compounds of these words and assume that there's a Sumerian base to it, which, by the way, Sumerian scholars don't agree with, that there's a Semitic and then a Sumerian base to Koine Greek. But even aside from that, I think we're really jumping chasms that we're assuming rather than we're proving when Allegro tries to make these connections with things like the Lord's Supper or terms like Christ. Yeah.
And not to be overly explicit, just because there might be moms listening in with their little ones and things like that. So I'll try and be as general as I possibly can. And you'll probably know where I'm going, Wes, because you read the book. But really, throughout his entire thesis about this Christianity being really this sort of nor this sort of movement that was based off of this fertility cult that was involved with psychedelics, is that he'll take a lot of different passages from throughout the Bible, all over the place, from Ephesians, from the Old Testament, but he'll always sort of make some sort of connection using, male female anatomy one way or another that's very sexually explicit. And like, I'm listening to this I've been a Christian for like 20 somewhat years, and I'm trying to make sense of how he is interpreting the tabernacle, like in the Old Testament, like the covenant language and things in Leviticus, and the assumptions that he's coming to, that somehow these are all very sexually explicit representations of these fertility cult that got really consummated, when these psychoactive substances in the Greek world became like readily available. How is he coming to these conclusions or justifying them?
I mean, the best way I can put it is very loosely, because what it does is it hops over all of the contextual understanding and the exegetical understanding of what's going on. I mean, both the New and the Old Testament have a very clear historical framework to them. I mean, this is one of the things that we talked about when we went to Egypt and did our recent Can I Trust the Bible series, was we talked about the fact that there is a very clear historical connection with something like the Gospels to the first century historical and cultural setting of Galilee and Judea. And one of the things that continually stood out to us as we traveled across Egypt was that the fact that there were historical cultural connections with the Pentateuch and with Egypt. We did at Apologetics Canada, the ministry I work at, my coworker Andy and I sat down while we were stuck in a mud brick hut in a sandstorm, which is quite an adventure. We did a podcast where we talked about kind of the things that stood out to us about some of the things that we had seen, particularly the temple structures that had different levels to them, which led up to a Holy of Holies, and how God didn't, it's not the Jesus mythicists who want to say that everything was copied and that, these stories in the Bible are actually just copycats of these ancient cultures, but that God actually used the cultural framework of the day to communicate to the Israelites in a way that they would have understood. And so the temple is very, very different from any other temple that exists. But at the exact same time, there's a cultural reference. And linguistically, there are a lot of words within the Hebrew of books like Exodus that can be directly tied to Egyptian society. Even the word Moses is an Egyptian name. We have Pharaoh's name, Thutmose. Mose is an Egyptian name. So it's tied to these cultural and historical connections. The Bible doesn't just exist in a vacuum. We can place it on a time frame in a historical setting. And so what someone like Allegro has to do is he has to leapfrog over those and say, don't worry about the man behind the curtain. Don't worry about the obvious. I want to lead you into another direction that actually has to do with fertility cults. And so in that sense, his contemporaries said, you're really ignoring vast amounts of historical data that existed in his day and that continue to be drawn upon in our own day as to the reliability of both the Old and the New Testament as being documents written within the timeframes that they're claiming to be written in by people that either were there or are communicating with people who were there. And I think that's a real flaw within someone like Marco Allegro, was that he uses these examples, but he's really bypassing all of the historical and archaeological and legitimate linguistic ties to these historical settings in order to make his thesis.
Yeah. What's up, everybody? It's the Super Sleuth here, letting you know that you can go to shopcultish.com and get all of our exclusive Cultish merch. There's the Bad Theology Hurts People shirt.
Jerry wears it all the time. I wear it all the time. Sometimes we wear it at the same time without even trying to have that happen on the show. And we're just like, whoa, you're wearing the shirt. I'm wearing the shirt. You could wear the shirt too. Go to shopcultish.com today and get your exclusive Cultish merch. Talk to you later, guys.
Andrew, you're there. Are you there, Andrew?
Yeah. Can you guys hear me loud and clear?
Yeah, go ahead. What do you question? I know we're having some Wi-Fi issues up in your super secret headquarters, but push through and tell me what's on your mind. What do you think about this topic so far?
Yeah, what's interesting to me about John Marco Allegro, he sounds like a little mini cult leader, right? Like doing what a lot of cult leaders do. No, all of what has been attested to throughout Christian history is wrong. Here's the secret. The secret knowledge is the sacred mushroom and the cross, right? A fertility cult. This is what it was all about. It just sounds so weird, right? And I can understand that coming in the 70s, for it to have a pull and a draw to people, and how it has the same effect today, especially with a lot of Joe Rogan's following. But I'll do admit as well, he does have people on his show that also try to help correct what John Marco Allegro was saying, and trying to state that it's not like what he is saying is absolutely true, which is a good thing. He gets multiple people on the equation in order to talk about it. But I think it just shows a larger issue within our culture, which is that people are looking for any other explanation other than Jesus Christ actually being who he says he is. And they go so far as to believe things that are not historically accurate, not empirically accurate, all the while saying that what they believe is the height of intellectual science. And that's what's interesting to me. I mean, there's historical accounts other than the Gospels that talk about Jesus being a real person, I don't know. It's interesting. I don't understand how John Marco Allegro would handle those types of things, but did he ever recant any of his lessons, or did he like double down on what he was talking about?
I mean, he didn't recant as far as I know. But I think related to what you're saying, Andrew, is that people like conspiracy. We like there to be more than what's at face value. And often reality is kind of boring. And there are things going behind the scenes. So there's enough fodder to lay credence to things like conspiracy theories, because let's be honest, we don't know what's going on 100% of the time. There are things going on behind the scenes. And as Christians, we believe that there's a spiritual realm that exists behind the scenes, right? So in one sense, I can understand a desire to want there to be something that's bigger, that has a greater impact that's going on. At the exact same time, as a realist and as a trained historian, I can say that there are times when the reality is what it seems to be, that we can use Occam's razor and we can say, okay, what is the most likely? And as a historian, I'm dealing with probabilities. What is the most probable thing that's going on here? Is it more probable that there was a first century Judean rabbi who walked the dusty streets of first century Roman occupied Judea and Galilee, who claimed to be God, who predicted his own death and resurrection, and then I believe did it? Or that those events were actually, despite all of the early Christian writings, despite individuals who claimed to actually know people who knew Jesus who wrote, despite the earliest Christians who went to their deaths proclaiming that they heard the testimony of the apostles that Jesus was God and rose from the dead, despite all of these things, that this was actually a grand misunderstanding of a hallucinogenic, ritualistic fertility cult. Well, let's be honest. I don't think that's what's going on. And I don't think that's what's going on because the preponderance of evidence lies on one side rather than the other. And I know there are some historians who would argue against me and say, well, I still believe in, Jesus turning water into wine and walking on water and rising from the dead, and that the probability of that based on a natural materialistic framework is pretty low, but I don't ascribe to a natural materialistic framework. So on my worldview, that is not all that low.
Yeah.
And I think the evidence is actually on the side for it. But once again, we're hearing hoofbeats, and Marco Allegro is assuming zebras. In fact, he might even be assuming unicorns. And I'm saying it's horses. And in fact, I can see the horses. I can draw the horses and tell you what they look like. And I might even be able to tell you what species they are. And despite that evidence that we can rely on, Marco Allegro is drawing different conclusions based on what I think is actually very sensationalistic conjecture. But people like sensationalism. And this is one of the things, you guys run into all the time. I run into in my own ministry and academic work, is that people want there to be a more sensationalistic explanation. It's why the Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Judas, Gospel of Peter, Gospel of Philip get the press that they do, even though they have no historical connection to Jesus. Yeah. It's because people like the sensationalistic stories.
Yeah. And as we kind of wrap up in part one, and hopefully, I know we had some Wi-Fi issues in this episode here, but as we wrap up in part one, like, what about the people who sort of make that conspiratorial argumentation against just sort of the field of scholarship or academia, where they sort of talk about how, well, all of academia, they're the ones who are the controllers, who's controlling information. And so in the same way, how you mentioned, people are making the argumentation how the Catholic Church is buying or suppressing Allegro's work, and somehow there's this deep conspiratorial view, or sometimes people will even say like, oh, well, this is just the Christian approved book section, that somehow there's this whole cabal that's deciding what you can and can't read, or as we talked before, what gospels are out there that you can and can't read. People articulate, as I mentioned before, that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were somehow some sort of conspiratorial grab for power by Constantine. Like, what's the argumentation against that as far as like scholarship and academia in general? Because a lot of people who kind of go down Allegro's route, they kind of appeal to that level of argumentation.
Yeah, I think it's just to lay out the evidence as simply and as clearly as we can. The only stories that get us to the time frame of Jesus or someone who knew Jesus are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And they very clearly have a historical and cultural framework in the first century. They have internal evidence that communicates that they are being written by people who were there during that time frame and are communicating truths about what they actually saw. Mm-hmm. And so we can go down the conspiratorial framework or down the conspiratorial pathway, and we can say that academia is just gatekeeping. But at the exact same time, I mean, academia is open, at least in historiography, the field that I've committed my life to. We're more than willing to admit that we're wrong. I mean, in my own field, in terms of manuscript work, there was about 150 years that believed that the Gospel of John, the consensus was that it was written in the 2nd century. And all of a sudden, we started discovering manuscripts that were written at the beginning of the 2nd century and kind of blew up this idea, because the manuscripts that we were finding were copies. They weren't originals. And at least I was taught that copies come after originals. And so that meant that the copies had to have an earlier copy that they were copying. And so there was a 150-year consensus of the Gospel of John being later that was completely blown up, and all of the textbooks had to be rewritten and push the Gospel of John back into the 1st century because of the evidence that came out based on the dating of the manuscripts. And so, I mean, we can say that archaeology and academia and historians are all gatekeeping this type of information. But as far as I've found, most historians are very open to being corrected. Archaeologists are more than willing to be corrected. I mean, the vast majority of constraints on archaeologists is funding. We can blame archaeologists for not going out and finding the information, but it's kind of like blaming your construction workers for not filling in the potholes in your road. and saying that they should be the ones that are doing the work, when really they're not responsible for that. There's, they're relying on the funding to come and fill in the pothole. So I think it's a rather simplistic argument, but I can understand it from people who maybe mean well, but don't really have a broader understanding of how this work is done. There's a mountain of evidence that sits on the side of Jesus and the historical Jesus and the historical reliability of the information that we find in the biblical documents that we call the New Testament.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that, man. This is really good. So what we're going to do is we're going to wrap up here. This is kind of a good way to segue. We're going to be going into part 2. We're going to be talking more about John Marco Allegro. And also, we're going to be talking about some of his hermeneutical justifications. And we're even going to be talking about Mount Sinai. Does Moses, when he encountered the burning bush, was that actually a psychedelic experience, with that psychedelic trip? This isn't what you'll see is this will be an example of a lot of the modern day argumentation you'll see really reiterated or just sort of regurgitated on a lot of different big podcasts out there. So just be aware of that. So all that being said, we will jump into that with our good friend Wess Huff in part 2 of where we enter into the world of John Marco Allegro and all that is crazy with the sacred mushroom and the cross. Talk to you all soon.
What's up, everybody? If you are blessed by this content and you want to support the gospel's proclamation to the cults while equipping the church to combat deception, then come join us and become a Cultish all-access member. You'll get an ad-free experience and exclusive content like Cultish the Water Cooler, where you hang out with Jeremiah and myself as we go live and interact with all of our members. You'll also get early release of episodes 1 to 2 weeks early. On top of all of that, there's also Cultish the Aftermath. It's an after-show commentary where we get to say all of the things that they won't let us. On top of that, you get all of the other training on apologiastudios.com. Come, be one of us. Head over to thecultishtshow.com or follow the link in the show notes and click the join button. Directly support the work of this ministry as the mission is completely funded by you, our listener.